Our first focus for this week is on it's a form called the lay or the Breton lay. And specifically, we're focusing on the most famous of lay writers, Marie de France, and her story of Bisclaveret. So I am about 99% confident that none of you have ever heard of Marie de France. And that's not altogether unsurprising to me, but Marie de France is pretty famous in literary circles because she essentially is the earliest of women, specifically French authors. And she was active specifically in the 12th century. And I have a question mark next to that date because there's no real record of her. And we only know of her by her first name. Her surname, de France, basically means that she comes from the French area, de France, of France, Marie of France. Her actual name is unknown. We don't know a whole lot about her. However, there are rumors that she is a half sister to Henry II. In her manuscript, her book of lays, she actually dedicates them to a noble king who was probably Henry II, and she may have been either an illegitimate half sister or some other relation. We don't really know. The point that I'm trying to make is that while we don't know a considerable amount about her origins, what we do know is that she has left a lasting legacy in both. She kind of crosses this boundary between French literature and English literature, and she is one of the most influential woman writers of the Middle Ages, but also one of the most influential writers of the Middle Ages, woman or not, because she bridges the gap between the oral tradition. Remember last week we talked about how all of these stories would have been passed down by word of mouth. She takes the oral tradition and she transcribes them, transforms them, and puts them down on paper for a larger audience. So I don't want to get caught up too much on the inner workings of medieval France and England and how they're all interconnected and woven, although that is a conversation I would love to have with you at some point. Ask me about it if you're interested. But the point that I'm trying to make is the what Marie de France does through her work is she takes what's going on in her contemporary society in what they call courtly culture, and she takes those languages, the English, the French, the Latin, and she takes the traditions of the English and the Celtic past, particularly if we look at someone like King Arthur, and she rewrites them in narrative form. And she looks at things like Aesop's fables and using an English translation she retells them. And we're not going to read any of her fables, but she is known for her retelling and transformation of fables. And what she says about her lays is that they came to her through oral transmission, and she connects them with the Bretons or the French. And a Breton lay is basically essentially a work that comes from the northern, beautiful part of the Brittany region, the Bretagne region of France. So the lay itself, and I know that I went on about that and I apologize. So, what is a lay? Basically, a lay is a lyrical composition that was often sung. Because if you think back to when I was talking about oral traditions, these storytellers would often sing their stories because it was a way for them to remember them. It was a way for them to engage. And the lays, the largest audience for these types of stories were in France, Scandinavia, and England. And I do want to mention really quickly that Marie de France is responsible for um, 12, 12 of these verse narratives, and the 12 that she writes, one of which will read, provide kind of a kaleidoscope view of relationships between aristocratic men and women in the late 12th century. And all of them really are very different. They're not really all from the same point of view. A lot of them are Arthurian in that they relate to King Arthur. This one that we're reading is not, but there are 12 of them, and they're all beautiful and fabulous. So, some topics that the lays cover. They look at romance, which I'll talk about in just a second, love, courtly or otherwise. And courtly love is another word for devotion to a devotion from a knight to an aristocratic woman, and usually that love is non-sexual, but we'll talk about that more when we come together. A lot of her lays look at relationships between all people, not just man and woman, but relationships between husband and wife, relationship between friends, relationship between knight and king, which were really important to her particular audience. So inevitably, though, all of her lays look at the divine universe rewarding goodness versus evil. There's always some sort of punishment for wrongdoing. So, what do I mean by romance? Well, romance in the romance big R, not romance little r. I don't mean like the Fabio romance novels on the cover of those paperback novels that you see in grocery stores. Romance big R is basically adventure. These are adventure stories. Usually there is a near perfect hero. In our case for Bisclaveret is a knight, and there is some sort of flaw that the hero has. There is an evil enemy, and a lot of times that enemy is disguised. There's a question of mistaken identity. There is a quest or a test that the hero must go through, and usually focuses or that quest or test is impeded or enhanced through supernatural elements. We have female figures that are usually very docile or in need of rescue, or we have some sort of female who is kind of a crone or a mother figure. And I'll let you guys be the deciding factor of what you think of our female figure in Bisclaveret. So, in these romances, which this Breton lay is an example of a romance, there's always some sort of pattern. And within that pattern, we have this kind of ideal culture that's blossoming. And within that culture, there is, I mean, think of like the Knights of the Round Table, the Kingdom of Camelot, or whatever you want to compare that to. But there's also within that ideal culture a test of the knights to see if they are worthy of representing and belonging to this ideal culture. And within that test and within that culture, there is some sort of treachery or a violation of an oath. And ultimately, there is a decline of that culture, or a kind of reimagining or reinvention or transformation of it, if you will. Part of that structure focuses on an integrated society. We have our hero who belongs to society. And because of this test, or because of this challenge, because of this quest, he has to leave society. He has to disintegrate and go out and kind of do this soul searching mission. And during this mission, at the end of this kind of transformative process, we go back, he's able to go back into society, albeit he is changed. So if you want to think about that, we have the kind of climax area here that changes the individual, and then that changed individual can go back into society. And society then will have to learn from the lessons that this man learns during his kind of transformative process. So it's all about teaching, and we learn from this one man's test, travel, or quest. Another way to look at it is we start with order, the order of a society that leads to disorder, something goes awry, and then order is then restored at the end. So keep those kind of ideas in mind as you read Bisclaveret. Bisclaveret, that's how it's pronounced, is one of the 12 lays of Marie de France. And if you can't tell from these various images, Bisclaveret means werewolf. And there are a lot of stories about werewolves during the Middle Ages were pretty popular. And if you look back over, I mean, they're pretty popular today. I mean, aren't they? I mean, if you look at something like Twilight, and I don't know any other ones off the top of my head, but werewolves were a source of popularity during the Middle Ages. And Bisclaveret is, you'll notice that it probably inspired other stories like The Beauty's Beast, or Beauty and the Beast, or a number of other stories where a man is transformed into this beast-like figure. The thing that's interesting is that Bisclaveret is not necessarily like our modern day werewolves. However, it would have been something to fear during this time, because wolves, ironically, were hated throughout Europe. They were considered to be predators or dangerous to people. And some people say that if you look at any of the scholarship or criticism that's been written about Marie de France and Bisclaveret, or a number of medieval werewolf texts, this kind of idea was associated with masculine sexuality and virility, So keep that in mind. An interesting fact is that the term werewolf can be found in legal codes to mean outlaw or someone beyond the mutual responsibility of community. And that's, you can look at werewolf in these medieval kind of texts and legal codes, and that's really what that term means. So keep that in mind as you read Bisclaveret. Is he really this kind of werewolf or someone that's transformed? Or is it something different? Though one thing that I do want you guys to focus on as we read this story is the role of the narrator as Marie as a storyteller. Because last week we talked a little bit about the power and the authority of a storyteller. And in the introduction to Bisclaveret, she kind of notes that her translation, her story, is not the same as other werewolf stories. It's very different. She makes a clear distinction between her Bisclaveret and the Bisclaveret of other stories. And by doing this, she kind of helps, or she blends the familiar with the unfamiliar, and she becomes part of tradition, but in her own way, she's creating something new. So keep that in mind as we read Bisclaveret. Like I said, it is one of my favorites. And we will look at how Bisclaveret and the lay kind of go hand in hand with our next kind of origin story, which is that of the fairy tale. How do we go from this kind of folky, folk tale poem type thing to another type of genre altogether? So I know this was a little bit long, but stay with me. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our other genre for the week in my next video. So I hope you guys enjoy Bisclaveret.